Hey everyone! This week we're going to start working on Chapter 3. We're actually going to spend 3 weeks in Chapter 3. It's the first real, I'd say, place where we're going to start running into some more difficult material. We're going to start running into some more serious problem sets. So there'll be 2 videos this week. This first one's just going to introduce some sort of concepts. The second video is going to be predominantly focused on what's called argument diagramming, the first sort of real set of problems we've got. So we figured that would just get its own video so we can do a little bit of practice there. And then we'll do the rest of Chapter 3 next week. Alright, let's get started. Okay, so far we've been talking about the idea of inquiry. And an inquiry is an investigation into some topic that's concerned with trying to figure out the truth of that topic. Last week when we were going through our guidelines to inquiry, we saw that one of the steps, step 3, was to sort of gather stock of all of the arguments and that people have sort of made with regard to whatever the issue of the investigation is. And we also saw at the end that your task at the end is to sort of evaluate all those arguments and see which side ultimately is able to produce stronger arguments for the claim or for the conclusion that it's advocating. Given that, most of what we're going to spend our time with this semester is talking about arguments. How do we evaluate them? What makes a good argument? What makes a bad argument? And that's what Chapter 3 begins talking about. So let's just begin by defining what an argument is. In this class, we're going to define an argument as an ordered series of claims that supply reasons to believe that some conclusion is true. Now, an argument's not necessarily contentious. Doesn't necessarily involve yelling, right? We don't mean argument maybe in that normal sense that it has in English language in many contexts. By an argument, we mean anytime someone gives you reasons to believe that something is true, they're giving you an argument, whatever those reasons might be. Now, there's a wide variety of different kinds of arguments. There's wide varieties of different ways people will try to persuade you that some conclusion is true. And today, we're not really going to worry about all of that distinction. We're just going to talk about arguments sort of just in general today. Then throughout the semester, we'll look at more and more specific kinds of arguments, probably starting once we finish up in Chapter 3. Alright, so let's break through the sort of parts of an argument. Every argument's going to have 2 features. One, it's going to have a conclusion, and indeed it's going to have one conclusion. Exactly one conclusion per argument. And every argument is going to have some number of what we're going to call premises. And indeed it could be at least one premise, but there could be, who knows, 100 premises if it's a really long, complicated argument. Premises are, in effect, reasons to believe that the conclusion is true. Things that the argument is saying, because of this, think that the conclusion is actually the case. Alright, so let's look at 2 examples of arguments. There shouldn't be anything too surprising here with anything that we've said so far. These arguments are different. We're going to evaluate them in different ways. But they both are arguments. We can sort of begin looking at them at least the exact same way. So here's the first argument. Kara is a mammal. Why? Because Kara is a cat, and all cats are mammals. Right? In this particular case, the first sentence, or at least the first clause in that sentence, Kara is a mammal, that's my conclusion. The second 2 clauses, Kara is a cat, and all cats are mammals, those are my premises. If you take those 2 things together, the argument is claiming that you will have good reason to believe that Kara must in fact be a mammal. And indeed, this is what's going to be called the deductive argument. The claim that the argument is actually making is that Kara must be a mammal. It follows with certainty. Here's a second example. I studied hard for the test. I did all the homework, and I've done well in all the previous tests. As a result, I'm quite likely to do well on this next upcoming test. Here, this is a different kind of argument. It's got a very different kind of structure to it, as we'll see, but it has the same basic parts. The conclusion is, in this case, that very last sentence. I will probably do well on this test too. And the reasons to believe that conclusion are true are the first 3 sort of claims that are made by the author. I studied hard for the test, I did all the homework, and I've done well in all the previous tests in the class. Note that in this case, right, each premise and each conclusion is sort of separated as an individual sentence. That's not true in the first case. In the first case, it was actually the whole argument was one sentence, but there were 3 different claims contained within that one sentence. So when you're dividing out premises and conclusions, what you should be looking for is how many claims they are, not how many sentences there are. So the first thing you should do whenever you encounter an argument, you need to sort of analyze its sort of quality, begin by doing what we're going to call standardizing the argument. That is to say, begin by identifying all the premises and identify the conclusion. It might seem like that's unnecessary, it might seem like it's really obvious, but indeed a lot of times when I see people go wrong, it's because they've sort of misidentified the conclusion in some sense. And if you can't figure out what the conclusion of the argument is, you're going to be in a lot of trouble to analyze it, because really all that's going to matter in analyzing it is how well do the premises support the conclusion. So you really need to make sure you know what's what. So the convention we're going to follow when we're standardizing is to number the premises sort of in the order that they appear in the argument, and then end with the conclusion, and just write that out as sort of a numbered list. So for example, let's look at that first example. Kara is a mammal because Kara is a cat and all cats are mammals. We said that our two premises were those second two clauses. So 1, Kara is a cat, 2, all cats are mammals, and then beneath those we'll write conclusion, Kara is a mammal. Now you might be wondering, okay, the first thing I gotta do is identify the premises and the conclusions. How can I tell what's what if I'm not sure what sort of protocol that I can follow? Unfortunately, there's no hard and fast rules that I can give you that'll work in every case. It would be very convenient if there was, but unfortunately there aren't. There's going to be some cases where you're going to have to sort of do some interpretive work, and indeed there'll even be some cases where it's just actually unclear, where the argument is sort of ambiguous, and you sort of just have to try to guess what the author of the argument was intending. But there are a couple of rules that I can release that will maybe guide you in the right direction. Again, none of these are absolutes, unfortunately, but they're at least places to start as you're getting into the habit and getting into practice of identifying conclusions. Then after you do this for a while, you'll just sort of do it automatically. You'll sort of just have a good sense of what the conclusion is in almost all arguments. Alright, so first piece of advice I can give, the conclusion should, again, usually, not always, but usually, in a good argument, certainly, the conclusion will always be the most controversial claim that you find within the argument. And that makes sense, right? The whole point of the argument is to give you reasons to believe that the conclusion is true, so the conclusion then should be the thing that needs reasons to support it. We'll actually see this will be a fallacy later in the semester that we'll talk about, where actually that's not true, where the premises are more controversial than the conclusion. But if everything's working right, the premises should be giving you reasons to believe the conclusion. Therefore, the conclusion is the thing that needs to be supported. It's the thing that needs justification. Another thing you can look at to help is indeed for what are called helper words. Right? There are certain clue words in the English language that, again, usually, though not always, will indicate that something is a conclusion or that something is a premise. Some words that indicate that what follows are likely to be a conclusion are words like therefore, thus, so, consequently, as a result, words like that. Now, not every argument will include such a word. But if you see one of those words, it's at least a pretty good bet that you're looking at a conclusion of some sort, at least. There's also words that indicate that what you're looking at may be a premise. So these are words like because, since, given that, as indicated by. If you see any of those kind of phrases, that suggests that what follows is likely to be a premise of some sort. And then the last thing you can look at, premises should give you reasons to believe that the conclusion is true. It will often not be the case that the reverse is true. The conclusion frequently won't really give you reasons to believe that the premises are themselves true. So if you can find something that seems like everything else is giving you a reason to believe it, and it's not giving you a reason to believe other things are true, there's a very good chance that what you're looking at is a conclusion. Again, none of those are universal rules, unfortunately, but they're at least good, helpful places to get started as you sort of get into the habit of quickly identifying the conclusion and the premises and arguments. So as I've described it so far, standardizing arguments probably sounds pretty easy, right? The examples that I've given you, just pretty much just list the premises in order, done, right? It doesn't seem too difficult. What can add an extra level of complication in some cases is just like people in general are often unclear, people are often really unclear when making arguments. Indeed, sometimes you'll find within arguments, whole premises are just missing. Sometimes even the conclusion will be missing. Then it gets really hairy to try to figure out what it is that the person is sort of trying to say, what the argument is trying to suggest or what it's trying to prove. And so as a result, you're going to sometimes have to do some real interpretive work to figure out what the argument means. There might be multiple ways you could render the argument. You're going to have to figure out what's the best rendering. To do that, what we're going to employ is called the principle of charity. You should assume that if you have multiple possible interpretations of what an argument could mean, pick the one that makes the most sense. It doesn't have to be one that's necessarily a good argument. Frequently, it's just a bad argument, right? But pick the one that at least makes the most sense of all the possible choices that you sort of have, all the plausible interpretations that you can give to the argument. Let's look at an example. Consider this argument. Taxes are too high, I'm completely broke. Alright, as I see it, the conclusion here is pretty straightforward in this case. The conclusion seems to be that taxes are too high. Right? That's probably the more controversial claim. Why think taxes are too high? Because I'm completely broke. The reverse doesn't really work. So, okay, taxes are too high, that's my conclusion. But how should we render this premise? How should we understand this I am completely broke? It's a little unclear, and it seems like there's a couple different ways we can take it. So here's two interpretations that I thought of we could give this argument. So here's the first one. Premise, I have no money whatsoever, therefore taxes are too high. And then a second possible interpretation. Premise, I am struggling to meet my basic needs, therefore my taxes are too high. Both of them are possible, both of them sort of follow from what's said, they're sort of reasonable interpretations, but I think it's pretty clear that in this case, the second argument is far more likely to be a good argument. It's far more charitable to assume that the person making this argument doesn't literally mean that they're completely broke, that they have no money whatsoever. They're using that sort of as a kind of shorthand to just indicate that they're struggling financially. That's probably a claim that's far more likely to be true as well, right? It's probably far more likely that someone's struggling financially than that they literally have no money whatsoever. And so therefore, the more charitable interpretation of this argument is the second one that I've given. The reason why we use this principle of charity is because our goal in an inquiry is to figure out what's true. It's not to win. Right? If you listen to, again, I hate to pick on politicians, but if you listen to politicians, their goal is frequently to win, right? Either to win an argument or to make their opponent look stupid. And then, sure, you very rarely see the principle of charity exercised in political discussions, or at least amongst, politicians, or people actually sort of actively engaged in political debate. But that's not what we're trying to do. We're not trying to win anything. Our goal is to figure out what's true. And so we're not served at all by looking at worse arguments. If we want to know if some conclusion is true, we should want to look at the best versions of arguments we can find that argue that the conclusion is true, and the best version of arguments we can find that the conclusion is not true. If we're looking at weak arguments, we're just not going to get much out of it. It's not going to help us in our goal in the inquiry. Alright, so I'll do for part one of this week's video. We've done a pretty good job, I think, of setting up what an argument is, what its parts are, and the first step, the sort of standardizing step. What we're going to do next is we're going to talk about sort of understanding better how the premises actually relate to one another and how they relate to the conclusion. So next we're going to talk about diagramming arguments. Alright, see you in a little bit. Bye!